Hello, this is Mrs. Scott, and today we're going to learn about the colony of Plymouth. Our two key lesson questions that you should be able to answer at the end of this video are: how was Plymouth different from both Roanoke and Jamestown? And what factors contributed to Plymouth's long-term success? Who were the Pilgrims? In England at the time, the Church of England was called the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and they were kind of similar to the Catholic Church, but they claimed to be different. And the Pilgrims were a religious group of people who did not like the Anglican Church. They wanted to separate and form a new church of their own because they disagreed with it. Sometimes they were called separatists. They wanted to separate from the English church, which was led by King James I, and create their own new religion because they felt that the Anglican Church was too Catholic-y. They decided they were going to leave to set up their new church, and the first attempt was in Holland. They left from Plymouth, England, and sailed to Holland here. And the people of Holland accepted the Pilgrims and their religious differences, and they were very welcome there. However, the Dutch culture and the Dutch language that was present in Holland, the Pilgrims felt it was too different. They're like, we don't like this. It's too different from England. So they're going to try again in the New World. And they get permission from the Virginia Company of London to get a charter to basically become a neighbor colony to Jamestown. That was the original plan. And so they are going to sail to what they planned to be very near Jamestown, near Virginia. Their leader on the ship was William Bradford. He was one of the prominent members of the Pilgrim Church. However, instead of sailing to Jamestown in Virginia to settle nearby, Mother Nature had other plans, and they're blown wildly off course. And so we can see the blue line represents their original plan to go to Virginia. However, they're going to end up in New England instead. They arrived and landed on November 11th of 1620, and they landed at the Cape Cod Bay in what we would call modern day Massachusetts. So the colony of Plymouth is going to be right here, and they're located here on this bay. Their location, even though it wasn't where they planned to be, was really good for them. It was on a hill, higher elevation, so they could see out better, and it was good, like military protection to see. They also ended up, they did not have to start from scratch. Where they had landed was actually nearby an abandoned Native American village. So they were able to use some of the abandoned structures, and the Native Americans had already cleared the land for farming. So they didn't necessarily have to start totally from scratch. So those are a couple of reasons why it was beneficial, even though it wasn't where they planned to go. Once they landed, before they got onto the actual land, but when they docked their boat, they're like, we're not in Virginia. We can't use the Virginia Company rules and laws. We're not going to be ruled by the Virginia Company because we're not in Virginia. So what they did was the men aboard the boat of land-owning status, about 41 men or so, they got together and they drafted what we call the Mayflower Compact, which is spelled up here in the top right corner. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement on self-government made by the Pilgrims, and they agreed that they would democratically vote for their leader and democratically agree on their laws. And so that Mayflower Compact is England's first written plan for government in the New World. It was a small step towards democracy. Women didn't get to sign or have any say in it, but the men did vote, and it would be democratic. And because of the Mayflower Compact's democratic setup, they will eventually vote Mr. John Carver to become Plymouth's first official governor once they land. Of course, they were not alone when they landed there. The local Native American Confederate group was called the Wampanoag Confederacy. A confederacy is just a group of people united in a common purpose. So the Wampanoag Confederacy was made up of several smaller Native American tribes. The Wampanoag, the winter before the arrival of the Pilgrims, had experienced a massive pandemic where over 90% of the Wampanoag tribes had died from illness. So they are desperate. And Chief Massasoit, who's kind of the leader of this Wampanoag group, he is desperate for an ally. He wants to rebuild their numbers because, right, just a bunch of them died. And he needs allies against the Narragansett, which are their enemy tribes. So Chief Massasoit wants to welcome the Pilgrims in hopes that they'll be allies. And he sent a Native American named Samoset, who was one of the few that spoke English, to greet the pilgrims. And Samoset will greet them and introduce them to the Wampanoag, and that's going to be important. And it paves the way for Squanto, who you probably have heard of before. His full name is Tisquantum, which is spelled over here. He had been a member of the Patuxet tribe, which you can see on our map. And as a child, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery and shipped over to England to be a slave. As he grew up to an adult, he was eventually freed and he was able to come back to this area, the Cape Cod area. Unfortunately, when he had arrived, that pandemic that killed a bunch of the Wampanoag had killed all of his Patuxet tribe. He was the only survivor. And we'll talk more about what he does in the face of that challenge momentarily. It was not easy for the pilgrims. Remember, they arrive on November 11th. It's winter. And while they do have some basic like Native American structures that they can use, they've got to do a lot of building. It's too late to plant a crop because it's winter already. And they struggle with food and shelter. Around 50% of the pilgrims will die that first winter of 1620 to 1621 from disease like scurvy, which is gross, starvation, hypothermia. Many died under harsh labor conditions because it was cold and they were trying to build more shelters. So that first winter is going to be the hugest challenge for the pilgrims, and literally half of them die. Now, how do they survive? Because of that introduction from Samoset, they will meet Squanto, and Squanto is going to go live with the pilgrims. He's like, all of my tribe is gone. I'm going to go help the pilgrims. And he teaches them to feed themselves, how to fish, what seeds are good to plant and when to plant them. And so in the spring, they're able to start feeding themselves. They will also be able to finally build better shelters in the spring. And in the spring, they will sign a formal treaty with the Wampanoag tribe that kind of guarantees them that protection. We, the pilgrims, will help you against the Narragansett, and the Wampanoag will help us like survive and feed ourselves. Which leads us to fall of 1621, which is the first Thanksgiving. And on that first Thanksgiving, they are celebrating, one, the fact that half of them survived that winter. And two, they are celebrating the great harvest that they had, and they were able to have such a bountiful, plentiful harvest because of the skills and the things that Squanto was able to teach them. So hopefully at this point, you will go back and make sure you finish your notes and make sure that you answer our 2 key lesson questions here at the end. If you have any questions, please let me know.